You may be wondering, Mr. Cox, how do I ask a question in Spanish? Well, let's begin. First, we'll start by talking about how we do it in English, and then we'll try it out in Spanish. And we'll use one of our favorite nursery rhymes to do it. In English, most common way to make a question probably is to put a question marker at the beginning. And we use do or does, one of the forms of that verb. So for example, I might say, hey there, black sheep, do you have any wool? Notice that basically I'm taking the concept, you have wool, but by putting do at the beginning, I turn it into a sentence. That do doesn't have anything to do with the actual vocabulary meaning of to do. It's just sitting there as a signal that, hey, this is a question coming up. And that's what we do in English. If you ask yourself, Mr. Cox, do all questions start with do in English? And the answer is no, but that one did. And that's probably our most common way of saying it. We have a little question signal, and we use the word do. We just borrow it for that purpose. The second way of asking a question in English is to use an interrogative at the beginning. Question words like who, what, where, when, why, how, and so forth. So I could say, where is your wool, black sheep? And again, because I'm using that interrogative at the beginning, I am making a question. Third way of doing it is to flip the subject and the verb. Now, a quick disclaimer here, you don't use this method to ask questions because you speak modern English. And this is an archaic way of doing it. That means old-fashioned. But you'll see this surviving in some old-fashioned stuff like old writing, or, for example, old nursery rhymes like Baba Black Sheep, have you any wool? Notice how I flip the subject and the verb there. So to do it, I take the statement, you have wool. Notice the subject and then the verb and then the rest of the sentence, normal word order. And I flip the subject and the verb to turn it into a question, and I say, have you any wool? That's it. Now it's a question. Again, that's old-fashioned. You'll hear that in Shakespeare and other old stuff and Baba Black Sheep, but you probably won't go around and ask your friends, have you any potato chips? Unless you're trying to sound medieval. Spanish is a different matter. They do use this method. I'll show you in a second. Method 4, add a tag question at the end. We talked about this before, but just to review, I can make a statement like you have wool and just add right at the end and turn it into a question. You have wool, right? There you go. You can turn any statement into a question that way, and that works in Spanish as well. Lastly, inflection. In English and in Spanish, actually, you can raise your tone, take a statement like you have wool, and turn it into you have wool? Now it's a question. Exactly the same words, but because we've raised the tone, it's a question now. And some languages don't do this, and they make fun of English speakers for doing that. If you want to have like a real bad English accent, you can, you just raise the tone at the end because they're like, why do you do that? In those languages, raising the tone doesn't make something a question. But in English and Spanish, it does. So there are 5 ways to make a question in English. We can use 4 of them in Spanish. But bad news, that top one, don't use it. We don't put any tag word at the beginning to make a question in Spanish. That just doesn't exist in Spanish. So we'll use the other 4. Here are examples of each. That second option, the interrogative. In Spanish, we know those now, all the question words, quién, qué, dónde, cuándo, por qué, and so forth. And we just put them at the beginning. In English, where is your wool? In Spanish, same process. ¿Dónde está tu lana? Lana is the Spanish word for wool. Option 3. Well, the third option, option 2 in Spanish, but anyways. Flip the subject and the verb. I told you in English this was archaic or old-fashioned, but in Spanish it is not. In fact, it is probably the most common form of asking questions. So, in English we had, for example, have you any wool? And they flip the subject and the verb. We could do the same thing in Spanish. Take the statement, tú tienes lana, you have wool, and let's flip that subject and verb, and we end up with tienes tú lana, have you wool. And again, that is perfectly normal in modern Spanish and very common. Sometimes you can drop that pronoun since it's implied in this case in the verb tienes. You could just say tienes lana and you don't have to have the pronoun in there. But if you did have the pronoun in there, it would go after the verb because it's been flipped to turn it into a question. All right, next option, add a tag question. We've already talked about this, but just as a reminder, you have wool, right, is how I'd say it in English. In Spanish, most likely we would use the word verdad, which means truth. And we'd say, tú tienes lana, verdad? Notice one thing here, the statement part is not inside the question marks. We leave that as a statement, tú tienes lana. And then we just tag the question word at the end. But the question marks go just around the question word, not around the statement that it's turning into a question. Anyways, this is how it's written out. And lastly, Spanish, just like English, can use inflection to turn something into a question. So you can just raise your voice and take any statement and turn it into a question. For example, in English, you have wool. In Spanish, tú tienes lana. And it's the same concept. So that's kind of handy. If you forget all the other ways to ask a question, you can just raise your voice with any statement and turn it into a question. There are 4 ways for you to make a question in Spanish. Make sure you got those concepts down and these sample sentences. Now you can set down your pencil, just relax and listen to this rendition of Baa Baa Black Sheep by Mr. Shep using his harmonica.